morning. Since Pastor and Chris could not make it this morning, I was asked to preach. And for y'all who don't know me, my name is Sarah Borman. I'm originally from Southern Virginia, but I married a New Yorker, which is why I now live in Central New York. And I'm going to tell you, just to make things easier, I'm going to tell you a bit about myself. God blessed me by putting me in a very godly family, putting me in a godly heritage. My paternal grandparents were missionaries in South Africa, which is where my father was raised. My maternal grandparents were people of great faith. They were actively involved in the church for many years. And my grandfather on that side was a tremendous example of faith, especially when it came to the faith of healing. And believe me, as a farmer, he needed a lot of prayers for healing. Got ran over by a tractor one time, ran into by a bull. Yeah. And then there was my parents. They're just amazing people. Just amazing examples of what it means to live out your faith daily. They taught my sisters and I so much about what it means to be a Christian and what it means to truly love God. Just to show you what kind of family I come from, my dad's a pastor. My mom teaches at a Christian school. My oldest sister is an assistant pastor. And my middle sister is a missionary in the Czech Republic. I learned so much about the Bible and about God at home, and I also learned about it at church and school, because I went to a Christian school. I had so many great examples of faith in my life, and as a child, I was on fire for God. But it was around middle school that I realized that my faith wasn't my own. My faith was my parents'. I had never actually worked it out for myself. And at that time, I was getting ostracized by my friends. They didn't really want to have anything to do with me because of my faith. So I decided that being on fire for God wasn't as important. I wanted to have friends, and I wanted to have fun. So God got put on the back burner of my life for a while. I didn't realize how far from God I had actually fallen until the end of my 8th grade year. And it took a knock to my pride to realize how bad it had really gotten. And things got better after that, and I grew close to God. Things were really good for about 2 years. I was close to God, and I actually had friends, and life was going great. Until my parents decided that God was calling them to be missionaries in Guatemala for the last 2 years of my high school experience. They asked me, of course, whether I wanted to go, but I knew God was calling us there. So it didn't matter what I wanted. We were going to go to Guatemala. But I was so angry at God. I was so mad at him because I knew it was his fault, because he's the one who wanted us down there in the first place. But it wasn't until a few months into my trip and living in Guatemala, and those months were great, by the way, that I realized that I really was angry at God. It was bad. But by the time I realized it, the damage had already been done. A wall had been built up between me and God. And nothing I could do to take down that wall. It took so long for that wall just to go away, for me to become close to God once again. And once, after I graduated high school and continued on to Bible college, where I majored in youth ministry, I still had problems. That wall would pop up again and again and again. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what I could do. And it was so discouraging. I just felt like I couldn't do anything. I couldn't draw close to God when that wall was up. Because it just felt like anytime I prayed, it felt like the prayers were just bouncing off the wall right back to me. Like they weren't going anywhere. I felt like I couldn't draw close to God. I don't know if you've ever felt like that. I don't know if you've ever felt like there was a wall, something separating you and God. But then I'd take the time to actually spend time with God, and the wall would go away. I'd be close to Him again. But then suddenly the wall would pop back up again. And I didn't know why, and I didn't know how to stop it from happening. And up until recently, if any of y'all were in the same situation, I really would have no advice for you. Nothing I could tell you to help you out. But I think I found an answer. And it was an answer I found when I was actually looking up a completely different question. The question I recently asked was, what does it mean to actually be a Christian? I've known so many Christians in my life, but so many of them have tried to live life as anybody else that does. They say the prayer, but then they want to act like the rest of the world acts. And I've done the same thing before. And so I was praying about that, and I was asking God, I was like, because what would I tell somebody? Why, if everybody wants to live like the rest of the world, then why would a non-Christian want to become a Christian in the first place? What's the difference? What would I tell somebody who was asking, a non-Christian who was asking about the Christian faith? What would I tell them what Christianity is all about? Well, when I was studying this, I came across an answer that answered the question that I didn't even know I was asking, which is, how do I stop that wall from popping up? And the answer to both those questions was walking with God. Now, describing our faith as walking with God is not a new concept. It's fairly common. I've heard about it a lot. And it's in the Bible quite a few times. I had a difficult time fishing through the different passages in the concordance that talked about our walk with God, or use the word walk, or different variants of the word walk. But it's the answer that popped out to me. And I began to think, what does it really mean? What does it actually look like to have a walk with God? So today I want to point out a few observations about our walk with God. And the first observation I want to point out is that our walk with God is a requirement, not an option. After we become a Christian, it is our calling to walk with God. It's what God expects of us. Look at what it says in Deuteronomy 5:32 and 33. This is what Moses is saying right after he is giving them the Ten Commandments, the Israelites the Ten Commandments. He's telling God what he wants. So Deuteronomy 5:32. So be careful to do what the Lord your God has commanded you. Do not turn aside to the right or to the left. Walk in the way that the Lord your God has commanded you, so that you may live and prosper and prolong your days in the land that you will possess. Moses is telling the Israelites what they need to live, like what God wants for them to do, for them to live and to follow Him. And He says, walk in all the ways that the Lord your God has commanded you. I want to read another verse to you, and I love this verse. It's found in Micah 6. And here, the prophet Micah has been telling the Israelites that God doesn't want sacrifices. He doesn't want gifts. He doesn't want somebody who's just going through the motions. You know, like us just going to church or just looking like we're living the Christian faith. He wants something so much more deeper than that. And this is what he says in verse 6, chapter 6, verse 8. He has showed you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. He says, what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Too many people think that they don't have to be a Christian, they don't have to live closely to God. To live the Christian life, to them, living the Christian life is about saying a prayer. That means that they'll get into heaven when they die. But it's so much more than that. It might seem a little bit harsh to say that it's a requirement for us to walk with God. But because, we never like to be required to do anything. It's kind of a word with harsh, bad overtones. But look at it this way. When you go to college, they require you to do certain things before you're able to graduate. And the more list of requirements that a college has, the more likely it is that that graduate will be more prepared to be able to meet the needs in the field that he's been studying. Be more prepared for the field he's been studying in. For me, when I went to college, I had a list of requirements that I had to complete before I graduated. One of the requirements is I had to get a D or higher in my lower level classes and a C or higher in my upper level classes. I also had to complete 5 student ministries before I was finished school, and I had to complete a 6-month internship underneath the supervisor in my chosen ministry. For me, it was youth ministry. And I thought those requirements helped me out a lot. They helped prepare me to be the minister to teens that I needed to be, that God was calling me to be. I didn't find those requirements to be stifling or unnecessary. On the contrary, they were very helpful to me. They're very helpful to all the students that go through Bethany Bible College to help them become the leaders that they need to be. Now, I'm not saying there's not some that slip through the system and they meet the requirements, but without actually living up to the expectations the school actually has of them. But our walk with God is like those requirements. But unlike the requirements in my school, there is no hidden pitfalls. There's no way to slip through the system. If you're actually walking with God and not just looking like you're walking with God, then there's no way that you will escape without becoming more like our God. Amen. Becoming closer to our God. Amen. And there's so many benefits and there's so many blessings that come with walking with our God. He's going to be there every step of the way. There's just so many aspects to walking with God. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, so I'll slow down. There's another difference between walking with God, the requirements that God has, and the requirements that the school had. With the school, you had to meet those requirements or you didn't graduate. But for God, He doesn't force you to do anything. He wants you to choose to follow His commands. And that's why our walk with God is a decision, not an automatic guarantee. Because not only does God not force us to walk with Him, but He also only gives us what we ask for. It says, Jesus said, "Ask and you shall receive." Unfortunately, a lot of people think that because the phrase walk with God is so familiar, they think that when you become a Christian, then that's just a natural result of becoming a Christian. That a walk with God is just what happens after you say that prayer. But that's not the case. It's a decision that has to be made each day to walk with God. I say that we have to have a decision because there's paths that we can have to choose. In Ezekiel 20, verses 18 and 19. It says, "But I said unto their children in the wilderness, walk not in the statutes of your father, neither observe their judgments, nor defile yourselves with their idols. I am the Lord your God. Walk in my statutes, and keep my judgments, and do them." This shows it's a decision because there's two different paths that a person can choose. They can choose the first path, which is walking their own way, walking the way that they want to, towards evil, towards things like idolatry. Or they can choose the second path, which is the path that God commands us to take, the one He wants us to take. And that path leads directly to God. If we walk in God's way, then verse 20 goes on to tell us that that is how we will know that He is our God. And there are other verses that mention the two paths that a person can choose. In Psalm 1:1, it says, it explains that the man who chooses not to walk in the way of the counsel of the wicked, that man will be blessed. Or it explains in different verses in the books of Kings that the kings were described in two different ways. Some of the kings chose to walk in the way of their fathers, walk in the way of evil, the way that they wanted to. But some of the kings, albeit very few of them, walked in the way of David, which was God's way. And other verses in the New Testament talk about the two different paths that we have to choose. And if it wasn't necessary for us to make a decision, then would it really be necessary to have all these warnings, all these comments about the two different paths, all these commands not to choose to walk after our own way, walk after the way of the flesh? They're necessary because walking with God is not something that just happens. It's something that Christians need to decide to do, and not just once. They need to decide again and again and again. It's a bunch of the same daily decisions that we have to make. Trust me. I know. I've been there. I've learned about it the hard way. I told you about that wall that was built up between God and I. And whenever it came up, I just became so discouraged and so lonely. I felt like there was nothing I could do to bring that wall down. I didn't understand how it just kept popping up again out of nowhere. Like I just could not draw close to God because that wall was in the way. And I felt like it just popped up out of nowhere. Like just all of a sudden. But that wasn't the case. It was a result of daily decisions not to follow after God, to not walk in His way. And I'm not saying that God wasn't there, because He certainly was. But I wasn't walking in close fellowship with Him. I wasn't paying attention to what He was saying. Instead of walking towards Him, I was walking away from Him. But once I would follow Him again, the closest to God would come back again. The wall would be gone. But unfortunately, that closeness didn't always last. And it would be only too easy to fall back into the same trap again. And to have that wall creep back up. I would never even realize that my small daily decisions, like not doing my devotions, not reading my Bible, or not going to church, would affect my life in such a big way. But it wasn't until a few months ago that I realized that I needed to make those decisions. I needed to spend time in fellowship with other believers. I needed to do my devotions each day. I needed to read my Bible each day. And it's not an easy task, and I fail it more times than I would like to admit. But I want to have a close walk with God. I want to spend time in a relationship with Him. Because I know I can appreciate life and I can love those around me so much fuller when God is right there by my side. The next observation I'm going to make about God will seem kind of obvious when I make it. But when it actually comes to living out our life with God, it's a lot harder to follow through. I think I've kind of hinted at it before, but I'm going to state it clearly because I think it's important to remember. Our walk with God is a journey, not a one-stop shop. As I mentioned before, our walk with God is a result of daily decisions that we need to make. It's not just one decision. It's not just that prayer that we make when we first become a Christian. I've known so many people who think that's all it is. They think that because they said that prayer as a kid, then they're set for life. But Christianity isn't a shop where you can stop and pick up whatever you need. It's not a shop that you visit once or every once in a while to get things like a ticket to heaven, or a request form for something that you need, or pick up a thank you note because God has blessed you with something. Christianity is so much more than a shop where you just stand around looking at what you want. Christianity is about living for God. It's about moving. It's about growing. Look at what Paul says in Colossians 1:10. He's telling the church, he's praying for the church, that this is what he wants for them. Verse 10, that you may walk worthy of the Lord unto all pleasing, being fruitful in every good work, and increasing in the knowledge of God. Did you hear that? Increasing. Or in another translation, it says growing. This is what Paul is praying for the church in Colossae. He doesn't want them to become stagnant. He wants them to keep growing, to keep increasing, to keep moving. In Ephesians 4 and 5, Paul encourages the church to walk as children of the light. And he tells them what they should do and what they shouldn't do as children of the light. And the way he writes it, it's obvious that walking as children of the light isn't something that just happens overnight. It's something that you have to walk towards, something you have to move towards. It's something that's going to take time to accomplish. You know, I know a lot about traveling. Technically, I haven't actually left North America because from the way I learned it at school, Latin America and the Caribbean are actually both part of this continent, but I've still traveled around a lot. I've moved around a lot. And so it's hard for me to stay in one place for a long time. And since my dad's family, some of his family lives out on the West Coast, we would take trips out there to see him. But because we didn't have the money to fly, we would drive. So between trips out to see my family on the West Coast, a trip down to the Southwest for a family reunion, trips up to school in the Northeast, and a bunch of other trips that I've taken, I've been to 47 out of the 50 states. The only continental state I'm missing is Nevada. So I love traveling. I love going to new places. I'm pretty sure it's in my blood. Everybody in my family has spent time living outside of the U.S. And I even got my husband to visit Guatemala and my sister for a week when she was living down there. I think that's why I love the thought of our walk with God being a journey. Because to me, a journey is something new and exciting. It's a new way to look at life. It's something that's different, a way to break from the mundane that happens in day-to-day life. And I want other Christians to look at their walk with God in the same way, as something new, as something exciting. And it doesn't matter if in the rest of their life they just like staying in one place. Because, that's okay too. I just get antsy if I stay somewhere for too long. But there's one more observation I want to make about our walk with God. For me, making a journey by myself isn't a lot of fun. I don't know how my sister travels to Europe by herself. I like having somebody there with me to share the moments with, to make it less boring, especially when you're on the airplanes. The sneak flying on airplanes is really boring. But that's the amazing part of Christianity. You see, our walk with God is a companionship, not solitary confinement. We don't have to go through this alone. In fact, we can't go through it alone. It's impossible for us to walk with God by ourselves. It is only by the grace of God that we are able to walk step by step with the living God. It's like how God promised Joshua, I will never leave you nor forsake you. That's one of the promises that make me so thankful that God never breaks his promises. He will always be there for us no matter what. I've had my share of difficulties and trials and temptations to know that I couldn't get through this alone. I couldn't make it through life without God being right there beside me to give me the strength to get through anything. Just look at the life of Enoch. There's not much said about him. He's found in Genesis 5. And there's only 4 verses about his life. And we don't know that much about him. We know that he was the father of the oldest living recorded man, Methuselah, and the great-grandfather of Noah, the one who built the ark. There's one other thing that sets him apart from the other people in the genealogy of Genesis 5. I'm going to read the verses about him, starting with 21. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. And after he became the father of Methuselah, Enoch walked with God 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enoch lived 365 years. Enoch walked with God. Then he was no more because God took him away. Enoch walked with God. Just the way that the verses explain Enoch's life, I think it's obvious that he had a close companionship with the living God. He didn't walk through this life alone. He didn't go through this life by himself because God was right there beside him every step of the way. Isn't that the kind of life that you want to live? Isn't that how you want to be remembered? That you walked with God? That would be just such an amazing thing to be known for. Hold on to that thought as you walk away from here today. Live your life in such a way that people will say that you walked with God. Remember, walking with God is what he requires of you and what he expects of you. Yet, it's made up of daily decisions to be with him, to love him, to worship him. And walking with God is a journey of increasing and growing. And it's not a journey that we have to make alone. God will be there every step of the way to guide us, to comfort us, to love us, to strengthen us, no matter what situation happens behind in our life. This is what it means to be a Christian and to live for him. To walk through this life with the living God being daily in His presence, and to know that He will always be with us.